G'day everyone, and thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction, and thanks to Renew for giving us this opportunity this evening. As Peter indicated, the Energy Change Institute at the ANU has an outreach program which you're all welcome to look at. If you go to the ANU website, or you just type in energy.anu.edu.au, then you'll find our webpage. And it'll also be at the bottom of the slides that I'll be showing. So maybe now is the time where I start to share the screen, and you'll be able to see the slides that I'll be talking to this evening. So here we go. Okay, so now you should be able to see the very first slide, the title slide. And the pictures to the right of the various speakers. Let me just start off by saying a little bit about the Energy Change Institute at the ANU. And again, just to indicate that we undertake research in many technologies to do with energy. You can see them all on the left-hand side of the screen in blue. But it's also important to note that we have a significant amount of activity on the human and social science side. So this is economics, regulatory, sociology, policy issues relating to energy. And without those disciplines, the technologies would go nowhere. So we have a very strong focus on bringing together the human and social sciences together with engineering, science, and technology to make sure that we have the capability needed to produce good outcomes in energy change. We have more than $100 million worth of facilities and more than 300 researchers, including PhD students, working in our program. So it's a significant part of what the university does. And we have a philosophy of being both technology and policy neutral, which means that we allow all our researchers to push their research as hard as they possibly can, providing, of course, that they get funding for it. And from that perspective, we funded directly from the university. We have, of course, researchers in all parts, every college of the university, and by and large, we are supported widely throughout the university for the work we do. So you might ask, first of all, why do we call ourselves the Energy Change Institute? And I'll give you a little bit of a motivation for that. The obvious reason, as you might expect, is that we require change to our energy systems in order to address climate change. But there are other very good reasons why we might want to invest in research on energy change. And one of those is energy and security. Many people, when they hear the words energy security, think about oil tankers going through the Straits of Hormuz and supply chains and all this sort of thing. But we're talking in much broader terms about ensuring secure supply of energy. And this is never more important when it comes to extreme climatic events and the like, but also to other threats to our energy security arising from cyber attack and the like. So energy and security is a very broad topic. And is a good reason for undertaking research into energy change to ensure that the security that we expect from our energy systems is delivered into the future. The other reason that we are looking at changing our energy sources is because while many of us have access to electricity, for example, there's around 1 billion people in the world who have no electricity whatsoever. And so providing them with energy in the form of electricity is an important driver for looking at new forms of energy that can undertake that. And you can think of things like microgrids run from renewable energy as being just one element of that. And then finally, energy underpins just about everything in modern society, and consequently, improving energy productivity is going to have an enormous impact on the economics, the social structures, and the wider societal issues that we like to enjoy. And obviously, we are very keen to ensure that, that energy continues to underpin the wealth, the lifestyle, and the opportunities for people into the future. So these are all good reasons for motivating energy change. And the one message that I would like to leave you with at the end of this presentation comes from primarily the first of these motivations, but it is also driven by all the other three. And that is that there is currently an enormous transformation taking place in the world's energy supply. And as we will see during the course of this talk, this will affect almost everything. And indeed, it will address all four of these issues that we've been talking about this evening. So now, if we look at the historical time frame since the Industrial Revolution, what we see is that the world's energy consumption has increased enormously in the last 170 or so years, since 1850, and that the mix of energy sources that we are harnessing has also changed quite significantly during this time. So back at the start of the Industrial Revolution in around 1850, most of the world's energy sources came from biomass, the burning of wood and other biomass derivatives. Interestingly enough, despite the fact the world's population has changed enormously during the last 170 years or so, the amount of biomass consumed by and large has remained constant. And this just simply reflects the fact that the enormous energy use that we have these days has been provided by many other sources. First of all, as you can see, back in the Industrial Revolution, we started to harness coal. Then when the internal combustion engine came along, oil became a significant energy source. And this was coupled at the same time with exploiting natural gas. And later, as electricity became the principal way of delivering energy, we harnessed hydropower. And since the Second World War, more importantly, since about the 1960s or so, we've also harnessed nuclear power, which has, again, been a significant component of the energy sources in some countries. And those of you with very, very good eyesight will spot that on top of those other sources of energy, there is a very thin purple line, which corresponds to the renewable energy that is in the system up until the end of this, this figure. And this comprises renewables such as solar and wind. And interestingly enough, although this is almost impossible to see on this scale, the message from this presentation is that renewables will, over the next few decades, replace entirely the energy that we generate using fossil fuels. This is going to be an incredibly large and rapid transformation. But we're right in the thick of it now, and the rest of the presentation will be about how that develops and what we might expect to see in the future. So now if we look at the climate change driver for energy change in particular, and also look at the same time frame, going back to the Industrial Revolution, what we see with the black line is the enormous increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This is measured in gigatons of carbon per year. And we have a trajectory which, if it continues on the red line, will lead us into dangerous climate change. So the aim of the world in the post-Paris Agreement is to try and decrease our emissions and to stabilise them at a level which will keep us below 2 degrees, which corresponds more or less to the green line on this graph, which is the 450 parts per million carbon dioxide level, acknowledging that we're already over 400 parts per million, so we don't have very much more to play with. How will we achieve this? In order to bridge the gap that's shown by the dotted arrow, we will have to undertake a very rapid change in our energy systems, of course, but we will also have to do a lot of other things. And this includes energy efficiency, which is more or less the low-hanging fruit, energy saving, turning off the lights, stabilizing the world's population, doing something about the destruction of our biomass and to reforest large areas of the planet. And indeed, we might have to also go towards geosequestration, which is the storing of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, and indeed direct drawdown from the atmosphere of carbon dioxide in order to keep below 2 degrees. However, the lowest hanging fruit in all of this is going to be changing our energy systems, which by and large produce most of the emissions that we see today. And so this is the topic of today's talk. And this change will involve moving to wind, solar, biofuels, nuclear, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about how this might happen and indeed what choices we have. But by and large, we have to do all of these things: efficiency, savings, population, forestation, geosequestration, and energy change, if we're going to have any chance at all of keeping below 2 degrees. If we look at where we are at the moment, the International Energy Agency has produced this graph which shows that by and large, the great part of the emissions that have been created so far have been generated by the developed world, the OECD countries. And the developing world, the non-OECD countries, have produced proportionally significantly less. However, the IEA projects that by the next couple of decades, the developed world will stabilise its emissions, and indeed the developing world will greatly increase its emissions, such that the burden of total emissions is roughly equally shared between the developed and the developing world. And this is important because burden sharing means that the entire planet has a collective responsibility in order to do something about our emissions trajectory and to keep the world below 2 degrees. And if we look at the carbon budget that we have remaining in order to achieve that, what we see is that for a 2-degree world, we've already produced 2/3 or more of the emissions so far, and that by 2035, we will have chewed up more than 90% of the budget that we need to keep below 2 degrees, leaving only a very small amount remaining in order to transform the world's economies and to go to zero carbon by, say, 2050. So the bottom line is that the 2-degree carbon budget is being spent much too quickly. If we look at where most of the energy demand growth is going to occur, which again, getting back to energy as a source of emissions is a close correlation with emissions growth, what we see is that many of the developed world economies have more or less stabilized their energy emissions. So that will form a very small proportion of the total growth in energy, the pie chart you see on the right. Most of the growth is going to come from the Asia-Pacific region, and this is outside the OECD countries. So this is primarily China, India, and Southeast Asia. And indeed, these are Australia's major trading partners, and we are a supplier of energy to this region. So this is going to be an important factor when it comes to ensuring that we're on a path towards 2-degree trajectory into the future. And as we know, energy in Australia is an abundant source. We are really an energy superpower when it comes to delivering energy to the rest of the world. And this graph here shows where the various types of energy are located on a map of Australia. The size of the circles indicates the amount of the resource. And what we see is that we have abundant reserves of black coal, the black circles, of brown coal, of natural gas, principally up here in the Northwest Shelves, but also on mainland Australia through various other sources of coal seam gas and unconventional gas. we also export a large amount of the world's uranium for nuclear power. We have the largest reserves in the world, shown by the yellow dots. And then, of course, when it comes to renewable energy, we have, again, enormous resources available to us. The blue around the coastline represents the opportunities for wave energy, although this, I would suggest, is relatively undeveloped in a commercial sense and is very expensive. We can also see the brown areas, which represent the wind resource in Australia. And again, this is concentrated around the coastal regions, but also in the highland areas along the dividing range. And then the pink areas in the centre of the country are the areas where geothermal energy is also prospective. Although once more, like wave energy, this is at a relatively early stage of commercial development and is very expensive. So clearly from this map, we can see that Australia has an abundance of pretty much all forms of energy, except for oil, which we do produce a small amount of, but which has mainly been imported into this country from other sources. Now let us turn our attention to solar energy. We've already noted that wind is abundant around the country, but solar is also a terrific resource for this country. The map here shows the solar radiation experienced in different parts of the country, and you don't need to understand what the numbers mean so much, except to note that this area up here in the Pilbara region of northwestern Australia has pretty much double the solar resource of the southwest of Tasmania. And if you compare Tasmania with the northern latitudes in North America, Northern Europe and North Asia, Tasmania has a very similar solar resource to those regions. And so by and large, we are significantly more blessed with solar energy than most of the world. And indeed, we have getting on towards twice the resource that many of the major economies have at their disposal. If we were to fill this little blue dot completely with solar farms, then we'd be able to generate enough electricity for all of Australia. And if we would do the same thing within the green dot, we would be able to produce enough electricity for the rest of the world. So this just indicates how abundant the renewable energy resource there is in Australia. Now let's look at our role as an energy trader. And indeed, as you can see, we do import a considerable amount of energy, particularly in crude oil and refined petroleum products. And while we are dependent on this source of energy from overseas, we do indeed produce some of that ourselves and also export it. But the dominant contributors to our exports are really coal and natural gas, which now is much bigger since these statistics were produced by the department 3 years ago. And then, of course, the third major export in energy terms is uranium. So note that the size of these circles is the amount of energy. It's not the dollars or the tons of these commodities that we export. It's actually the amount of energy. So significantly, we export about a third of the amount of energy in uranium as we do in coal. And that just shows how energy dense uranium is as an energy export. So that's the current situation regarding the way that we trade with the world, and remembering that we're trading as a major contributor to the world's energy sources, then we have an important role to play in the energy transformation that has to happen as we go towards addressing climate change. And indeed, this is the subject of a grand challenge here at the ANU, which the Energy Change Institute has put forward, and for which we've been funded $10 million over 5 years. And this grand challenge is to future-proof Australia's energy exports based on our abundant sources of renewable energy. And we call this grand challenge zero carbon energy for the Asia Pacific, for the obvious reasons that we provide a lot of energy for the region, which is going to dominate energy demand growth in the coming decades. If we look at what we export now and we calculate the emissions that happen in the Asia Pacific region as a result of these exports, then the numbers here in the panel show that for natural gas and thermal coal, we export 197 and 397 million tonnes of carbon dioxide that is released when these fuels are burnt primarily in the Asia Pacific region, which is the market for 95% of the commodities that we export in this way. If we also look at the consequential emissions for iron ore, when that is turned into iron and into steel overseas, and again, most of this happens in the Asia Pacific, then we are responsible for a further 1,118 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions per year. And again, this occurs mainly in the region to our north. Our grand challenge is aimed at transforming this picture by simply layering over the top a new energy prospect, and that is to provide energy in equivalent forms or in equivalent amounts through the use of our abundant renewable energy resources. So the map on the right-hand side shows what would happen if, rather than exporting an equivalent amount of energy in coal and gas, we exported the same amount of energy either as electricity directly through a cable under the ocean, or as hydrogen, which is made from renewable electricity and water using a process called electrolysis, which I'm sure you've all heard about at school. And that creates hydrogen, and if it's from renewable electricity, it'll create hydrogen that in the colloquial language is called green hydrogen. So let's assume that Australia in the future exports as much energy and electricity and green hydrogen as it does now in coal and natural gas, and that 20% of this is in electricity and 80% is in green hydrogen. Then the numbers that you see in these ovals at the top indicate how much electricity we'll export, which is of order 460 terawatt hours per year. And you don't need to understand what those units are, except to know that at the moment, the Australian electricity sector produces about 260 terawatt hours a year in total across the country. Then if you look at the prospects for exporting green hydrogen, again, if it's 80% of our energy exports, that represents 55 million tonnes per year of green hydrogen, which would require 3,590 terawatt hours per year of renewable electricity. So these are huge numbers. Then if we assume that we turn all of our current iron ore exports into green steel, and you can do this by using electricity and by using hydrogen to reduce the oxides into metals, then by using renewable electricity of order 2,000 terawatt hours per year, we could export 500 plus megatons per year of green steel. So again, these are enormous numbers. And the land area required to do that is represented by that square that you see up in the northwest. And although, again, this is a big area, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. So this just shows that if we are to have a continuing future as a world steel provider and as a world energy provider at the same level as we are now, then this is all possible using renewable energy. And our grand challenge is to establish what are the opportunities, the challenges, the barriers through our research to underpin a future export industry based on renewable energy. So now let's turn our attention to Australia's domestic sector, having looked at our role in the world as an energy exporter. And we all know that from the Paris Agreement that we have, that we are committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% based on 2005 levels by 2030. And what this means is that we need to go from 612 down to 441 megatons of CO2 emissions a year, and we're already partway there. We're already at the point here where we have around 97 megatons per year reduction to go before 2030. The bad news is that Australia is, at the moment at least, moving in the wrong direction. This diagram here from the Department of Environment and Energy shows our emissions over time, going back to 2008. And as you can see, things decreased quite well there for a period. but they seem to have flattened out, and there might even be a slight uptick here in recent times. Clearly, this is not what we need. And indeed, if we break this down and we look at our emissions per capita, which is the blue line on this graph, what we see is indeed that we are moving in the right direction per capita, but across the entire country, our emissions are, if anything, just flattening out. So the key reason behind this, of course, is going to be because our population is increasing. As our population increases, our total emissions increase, and that's the picture we're finding ourselves in at the moment. Likewise, if we look at the emissions per dollar of GDP, again, the good news is that our emissions intensity is dropping significantly, but our GDP, of course, is growing. So we're generating more wealth, we're creating more products, etc. But this is, again, not moving us in the right direction in terms of our emissions. So now if we look at where these emissions occur, this pie chart shows the breakdown into the various sectors in our economy. Electricity is the single biggest area that contributes about 1/3 of our total emissions. Then there's stationary energy, which is things like space heating, that contributes another 19%, a similar amount from transport. Then there's around 11% from fugitive emissions, which is generated by the extraction of natural gas and coal and other commodities. And then we have a slightly smaller amount from industrial processes, which include things like concrete and the production of steel and other refined metals. Finally, we have agriculture at around 13%, and then waste, and then land use change, bringing up the final numbers. How then should we address our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, as I said earlier on, the best way to do this and the lowest hanging fruit lies in turning our electricity sector into a renewable energy sector. And indeed, if we are going to reach our greenhouse gas commitments from the Paris Agreement of 28% reductions, that is the easiest and most straightforward way of doing that, followed by the electrification of all the other sectors. So in other words, we electrify stationary energy by using electricity to do the heating, heat pumps and the like. We adopt electric vehicles, etc., and we use potentially hydrogen to provide energy for transport. We reduce the fugitive emissions by reducing our extraction of natural gas and other fossil fuels. And then we replace the fossil fuel processes in industry with renewable energy. So as you can see from that chart, we can address more than 3/4 of our emissions simply by making our electricity sector entirely renewable energy based, and then by electrifying all the other sectors. Now, agriculture is going to be very difficult to address because it's very hard to stop cows from belching. But nonetheless, there are ideas on how we might do this, but the renewable energy side of things is not going to play a big role. But nonetheless, we need to do everything that we can to increase the amount of renewable energy in the system, and then to continue to electrify all the other sectors as we go along. How are we going to do this? Clearly, we have to move away from the energy generating sources based on fossil fuels that we have at the present, coal, oil and gas. But then we have many other opportunities that I'll now go through, and I'll talk a little bit about which are going to be the most prospective in coming decades. One of those is nuclear, and we are all familiar with nuclear fission, which is the splitting of uranium atoms to generate energy. That's the type of nuclear power used in conventional nuclear power stations around the world. But there's also the prospect for nuclear fusion, which is the joining together of nuclei of hydrogen isotopes, which again can release energy. And indeed, this is the energy that powers the sun. So there is a massive international collaboration going on at the moment to build the first demonstration reactor to harness the fusion power of the sun on Earth. This is taking place in Cadarache in France. It's funded by most of the developed countries, and it's aiming to show break-even energy. In other words, you produce as much energy out from the fusion process as you put in with electricity, and it hopes to do so by the early 2030s. But then, of course, a proper commercial reactor would have to be developed after that, and maybe we might see one at around 2050, and clearly that's too late for climate change. So although fusion might provide an energy source for the latter part of this century, it won't save us from the impacts of catastrophic climate change. Then we have global forms of energy, broadly speaking. These are both tidal energy, which is effectively harnessing the potential energy of the ocean as it's being attracted through gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. And again, like wave power, I would suggest that this is not yet at a commercially viable level. It's very expensive. And the same is also true of geothermal energy. And then finally, I've got listed here the remaining types of energy at our disposal. And these I've called solar, and they break into two forms, direct and indirect. And you might say, oh, what about wind and all the others? Well, we'll come to that in a second. So if we look at direct solar, that's things like solar heat, heating up the hot water system on your roof. Solar photovoltaics, that's solar cells, the solar panels on your roof that produce electricity. Then there's thermal electric, which is the use of solar heat to create steam and drive a turbine. And then there's thermochemical, which is a storage of heat into chemical forms for use later on. So that's direct solar. And then there's indirect solar. So I classify wind as indirect because wind is caused by convection of the atmosphere driven by the sun. So that causes movement of air, and that creates wind. Hydro, likewise, is caused by evaporation of water, which is then condensed into clouds and forms rain and fills dams. Wave power, likewise, is driven by the wind, which is driven by the sun. And of course, biomass harnesses the sun's energy using photosynthesis. So those are all indirect forms of solar. What then out of this grouping is going to be the most likely way ahead in order to replace fossil fuels? Well, I maintain that currently at least the most prospective of these for countries around the world are going to be renewables such as solar PV and wind, also coupled with hydroelectricity, but I would suggest that there is not much room to expand hydro around the world. We'll certainly use existing hydro, but environmental reasons and other reasons mean that we're unlikely to see much of an increase in that direction. And then, of course, for those countries which allow nuclear fission, conventional nuclear power stations, that is also a prospect for them, although it is forbidden by federal legislation at this stage in Australia, and we can return to that later. Fusion, as I said, might help us towards the latter part of this century, but it won't be a useful contributor to addressing climate change. So those are the principal opportunities at our disposal, and we now can look to see how this might play out, how the different forms of energy at our disposal might form part of a future energy mix. To do that, I'd like to tell you something about learning rates. And in an economic sense, a learning rate is a decrease in the cost of a particular form of production, whether this is a Model T Ford, or it's a fridge, or it's a coal-fired power station, or a solar panel, or a wind turbine, doesn't matter what it is. It's the decrease in the cost of a unit produced as you increase the number of units of production. And the learning rate is essentially driven, as its name indicates, by learning, by research, by innovation, by improved practices in the production line, all of these things. And over time, and as the number of units of production increases, the learning rate gradually matures and flattens out. But then along comes a competing technology, and what we can find happening is that the learning rate of the new technology can indeed be more rapid than the old maturing technology, and at some point the learning rate, the new technology takes over, and at that point it outcompetes the old. And indeed, this is exactly what's happening at the moment in our energy systems. Here we have, for example, the learning rate of solar PV, and as you can see over time, since the early 1980s, up until the present, the cost of a module, a solar panel, in euros per watt has gone down by a factor of 100 during this 40-year period. That's a truly outstanding figure that it's hard to imagine any other product, fridges, cars, you name it, that has decreased in price over that time. So that's a rapid learning rate if ever you've seen one, but the same thing also applies in other areas. So just to let you know that this effectively means that every time you double the unit of production of solar panels, the price goes down by 24%, which is equivalent to a compound annual growth rate of 33% sustained over more than 30 years. Other energy sources have similar rates. Here's again the PV learning rate. The learning rate for onshore wind is also quite rapid. For batteries is not quite as rapid, but nonetheless going down fairly quickly. So this indicates that there are various learning rates for various technologies, and the interplay of these learning rates then decides which technologies win out in the end. So this diagram shows the very latest calculations which have done in the CSIRO, Australian Energy Market Operator GenCost program that was released recently. And what it shows is that because of the rapid learning rates, that wind and solar PV are now the cheapest form of new energy generation if you have to build a new energy source that we have at our disposal. And this compares to the current cost in dollars per megawatt hour. That's what the vertical scale is for coal and for gas. And you can see that wind and PV are nearly a factor of 2 cheaper than coal and gas. And even if you add in the cost of additional storage, which you need to do because obviously wind and solar are intermittent, so you need to store the energy for when they're not available. Even if you add in that cost, what you see is that it still is competitive with the cost of coal and gas. And for this reason, you hear the statement often repeated by energy companies and by experts in the field that no Australian company is ever going to build another coal-fired power station. Unless, of course, you and I as taxpayers subsidise it through government subsidies. So this is showing the learning rate in action, and indeed, as we will see in future years, these learning rates will make wind and solar even more competitive, and solar probably the most competitive of the 2 renewables. If we look at how this has played out in recent times, this diagram shows our total energy on the top, which is created in the electricity sector. That's the black line. It also shows that we have had a more or less decreasing share of coal in that. That's the purple line, and a decreasing degree of emissions as time goes on. Interestingly though, we actually are generating less electricity now than we used to, and that's a combination of things. It's a combination of the fact that there is more solar going onto rooftops, so we don't actually need as much central generation, and that's shown by the red line if you add in rooftop solar. It's also driven by the shift in our manufacturing base away from heavy duty manufacturing, such as the car industry termination. It's due to the fact that prices have gone up, and so people are turning off the lights. And it's also driven by improvements in energy efficiency. So all these add together to mean that we have less energy demand in the current years compared to about a decade ago. And again, this is why we said earlier on that the developed world is using less and less energy compared with the developing world, which is still growing. Interestingly enough, what we see is that our emissions at some point turned around and started to increase again. And those of you that look very closely to the date on the bottom axis will see that this happened on the 1st of July 2014. And those of you that remember your history will know that that was the day that the carbon tax was removed. What happened then was that fossil fuel sources were then brought back online because they weren't being taxed as much. And this resulted in an increase in emissions. And you can see the increase in coal shared generation after that period. Indeed, if you look at the bottom graph and you see the mix of energy types, so black coal, brown coal, small scale solar, gradually increasing over time, wind and other renewables increasing over time, gas and hydro going up and down depending on demand. What we see is that the instant that the carbon tax was removed, brown coal came on before black coal. And that's a clear indicator because brown coal is more carbon emissions intensive and cheaper, that this was the preferred energy source once the carbon tax was removed. And then eventually, of course, black coal picked up yet again. So this is a clear indicator that, that these economic tools do work and that they are effective in reducing our emissions. So here's a graph which shows the size of the task that we've got to undertake. It's the electricity generation since the early 90s as a function of fuel type. And you can see that, that most of the generation during this time has been from fossil fuels, indeed 84.3% back in 2016, 2017. And the small grey area of renewables has been growing, but nonetheless, we're still dominated by fossil fuels. However, this is changing. And so more recently, we now have more than 25% of our electricity coming from renewables, and we are moving very rapidly in the right direction. What is needed to make this change happen? Well, clearly the economics is driving this to a very large extent. As we've heard, the learning rates are really making the economics unarguable for wind and solar PV. But we also need consistent long-term measures to address climate change and indeed to align this with energy policy in order to give industry the certainty to invest in renewables and make this transition happen. And this is exactly what the chief scientist said when he produced this review of the national electricity market back in 2017. Of course, at that point, the only opportunity that we had to align energy climate policy was a carbon price. But of course, that was removed before the chief scientist's report was even started by the coalition party room, which removed the carbon tax in 2014. However, the chief scientist recognised that it was important to have policy to drive the transformation in the electricity sector that was needed, so he proposed an emissions intensity scheme. But again, before very long, this was once more ruled out by the coalition party room. So an alternative mechanism was proposed, the clean energy target, in order to try and drive the transformation of the electricity sector. But once again, this was ruled out by the coalition party room. Finally, the chief scientist delivered the blueprint. The government went away and decided that it had to do something even more to align energy and climate policy and drive this transition. And so, as we all know, it proposed the National Energy Guarantee. But once again, this was ruled out by the coalition party room. So effectively now, we are in almost a policy-free zone. Almost because we still have the renewable energy target, which was achieved last year, and for which the credits still operate, the large-scale and small-scale guarantees. But apart from that, we've already achieved the renewable energy target. There is no energy and climate policy to give industry certainty, to allow them to go to the banks and request funding for investment. And of course, when the banks see that, that there is no policy certainty going into the future, they simply increase the interest rate in order to cover the risk about what might happen in the future. So this is preventing investment in renewable energy, and we are in a policy limbo currently. So what we're seeing is totally being driven by the economics of the learning rate. This graph shows what's in the renewable energy pipeline currently. It shows the renewable energy capacity being installed in wind and solar. That's at a rate of 4.3 gigawatts per year at utility scale, and with rooftop solar, it's 2 gigawatts per year. Just to give you a feel for these numbers, a gigawatt is roughly the size of a large coal-fired power station. And of course, we know that renewables are intermittent, they don't operate all the time. So even if you divide this by a factor of, let's say, 3, that's still a couple of coal-fired power stations per annum in total, with 6.3 gigawatts being installed at the current rate each year. So that is an enormous rate. In fact, Australia leads the world with 250 watts per capita per annum renewable energy installation. That is a truly remarkable number. In fact, we are leading the world by a factor of 4 and 5 compared to our major competitors. Now, let's simply assume that we've demonstrated this ability to install renewables at this rapid rate. What does this mean for decarbonising the electricity sector? If we simply extrapolate the graph that we saw in the last slide with the green line and assume that annual energy demand remains constant, which more or less is what is projected, then what we see is that we have the capacity, at least at the current rate of renewable energy installation, to reach around 50% renewables by the mid-2020s. Again, this is assuming that nothing gets in the way. And what can get in the way? Well, of course, government policy uncertainty. And indeed, we have a need for government planning because we are currently running an outdated energy system based on a centralised generating model. And this produces a dysfunctional transmission market, which is not providing the transmission lines that we need to reach the renewable energy regions. And this is the reason that the Australian Energy Market Operator has proposed renewable energy zones, which then can drive the creation of transmission lines into these areas. So New South Wales and Victoria are moving down that path. They've moved away from the COAG Council on energy and are doing this alone because they realise we need central planning in order to make this work. Another thing that might get in the way is the fact that we need more storage. We need to incentivise battery storage, off-river pumped hydro storage, the Snowy 2.0, and we need to do that in a way that brings the storage online so it can support the rapid development of renewables that we're seeing at the moment. And then, of course, the other thing we should do is do something to incentivise demand response in order to be able to turn down demand for electricity at a time when the renewable energy sources aren't operating, and that reduces the cost because we don't need as much storage. So all of these things need to be organised in a central way by government, and there is a clear role for government moving forward in making this all happen. So if Australia is allowed to continue installing renewables at the current rate, then we've already met the renewable energy target for 2020 a year early. We could potentially reduce our electricity sector emissions by their fair share of the Paris Agreement, i.e. 26% in the next couple of years. We could even achieve our entire Paris goals for the entire economy by 2025, assuming that our emissions don't increase any further, and we have seen an increase in recent times, and assuming that electricity demand remains the same and that we continue installing renewables at the current rate. But there are lots of things that could get in the way of that, as I've just indicated. And again, we could reach 50% renewables by 2024 and potentially 100% renewables by the early 2030s. Those are really rapid changes to our economy, And again, there are many things that might stop that from happening, as I've indicated, but nonetheless, we've demonstrated already the capacity to be able to do this if the policy settings are correct. So how high can the renewable installation rate go? Well, currently we're at order 25%, but once we get above 50% renewable energy generation, we'll have to address intermittency in a more strategic way. We have to overbuild the supply of energy sources. We have to build additional storage capability. We have to build additional network infrastructure. And our work at ANU shows that this will roughly add 50% to the cost of renewables, but it will still be cheaper than the cost of a new coal-fired power station, even without a carbon price. With a carbon price, a coal-fired power station cost would go out the window. So now just to sum up where we are. So the worldwide trends in energy that we might expect to see in the coming decades, we'll see a rapid decarbonisation of the energy sector. Solar, wind, hydro and nuclear fission will take over the energy mix. Fusion won't happen till too late for anything to be done about climate change. We will also see an increasing availability of domestic energy sources, so solar and wind, unconventional gas, unconventional oil. And this will result in greater energy security, which can only be good for world peace because nobody's going to go to war over somebody else's solar and wind. The other change that we'll see will be that the world will become much more like the Internet of Energy. There's more disseminated generation, disseminated storage, and disseminated demand response. Millions of people in the economy will be contributing to rooftop solar, to batteries in their cars and garages, to turning off equipment when required to do so by the electricity company. And the robustness that this creates will be very similar to the robustness of the internet because of the opportunity to shift energy around in different pathways and to have multiple redundancy in the system. The downside, of course, is that there'll be increased vulnerability to things like cyber threats and also ultimately to extreme weather events due to climate change. In Australia, there are a number of things that might get in the way of this energy future. And so we're going to have to be very careful to make sure that we travel along this path in a rapid and efficient manner. The first thing we need to do, absolutely, and most importantly, is to address the continuing government policy uncertainty that has riven the sector in the last decade or so. We absolutely need to introduce a carbon price of some description. This is what all economists say all over the world. It's what the major corporations are calling for. It's what the finance sector is calling for all the peak bodies in business and the private sector. They're all calling for a carbon price. And that's because it's the most efficient way for an economy to decarbonise, and in particular for an energy sector to decarbonise. And we need to invest more in renewables, transmission and storage. The other thing we need to do is make sure we have all options on the table. That includes nuclear. Whether it's expensive or can't meet the goals that we have for it is another matter, but we shouldn't rule it out absolutely. We should have the opportunity to use solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, all the other renewable and zero emission sources in order to achieve our goals. We need to educate people around community acceptance. We've seen the issues around wind farms being installed in different locations, even solar farms in some locations. We have to educate people that, as in other parts of the world, energy sources are everywhere and we have to make use of them in the best locations that we can find. And then finally, it's really important in all of this that we address social equity issues. We need to make sure in this energy transformation that everyone is brought along with the change that we have to have, and that nobody is left behind in this process. So for example, people on low incomes who can't afford batteries, who can't afford rooftop solar, who can't afford household energy demand response systems, they all need to be able to participate in this and not to then bear the burden of the remaining costs of the grid itself. So that's where I'd like to leave it. I hope that's been useful and informative. and I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Peter and Andrew.
Oh, Andrew, I haven't given you a chance yet. Would you like to say a few words?
No, I just wanted to thank Ken again for making the time to give us a talk. It's been really interesting to hear, even though it's a little bit depressing in some ways. We're still battling the same obstacles we've battled for a very long time. But I'd like now to, if we can, just move over to questions, because we've got a lot of people still online and a whole stack of questions for Ken.
There are plenty of IEA charts from Angus King's question that are more recent, but they don't show the sort of things I wanted to display. So that means that things haven't actually changed very much. I'm just showing the same data. The next one from Claire Vivart, the graph doesn't account for hydro energy. Don't know what graph that is. Yeah, maybe write a more detailed question. Peter Wanfor, given the terrible long-term consequences of coal seam gas extraction, would you agree it should be listed as a liability or as a minimum something to leave where it is rather than as a resource? Well, it's certainly a resource. So my view on any form of energy or anything really is that the smart policy way to address something which has externalities, whether it be carbon dioxide emissions or pollution of the environment or whatever it might be. To address externalities, you have a proper regulatory system in place and you enforce the regulations. You do monitoring, you make sure you follow up the monitoring process. So that's the way to do smart regulation. The brain dead way of having that sort of policy is to have prohibition. That's just to simply prohibit something and not even consider it. So I think that that many of the energy sources that we see today fall into those categories. If you monitor carefully what is going on and you take into account the environmental consequences and you regulate it properly, you'll get the right result. So now, Michael, exporting green steel, does this mean no more iron ore export? Yes, if we're going to turn all our iron ore into green steel, that's what it means. And that's the basis on which the figures were calculated. GCNN, with brown coal to hydrogen, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So let's go to Angus King, who's already had a go. So let's go to Andrew Redaway. Could you please comment on the amount of energy storage required? The SIRO chart included 2 hours or 6 hours storage. For a fully renewable grid based on wind and solar, much more storage is required, more like 30 hours on an average basis on Andrew Blaker's analysis at ANU. So that ANU analysis actually shows something a bit different. What we're talking about on the CSIRO chart is 2 or 6 hours storage for each wind farm or each solar farm that is being considered. But if you do a systems-wide analysis of the amount of storage you need, what you find is that because you've got opportunities for wind and solar in different parts of the country to contribute at different times, depending on what's happening, and you then can share the storage around, provided you've got enough transmission connecting the various sources, you don't actually need as much storage. Indeed, building lots of really strong transmission and making this a well interconnected internet of energy will reduce the amount of storage significantly. Just take with a pinch of salt the GenCost study, which is more about plug and play. If you had to plug in and plug out an energy source with storage, what would that cost is what they're essentially saying, and not taking into account the shared energy side of things. A question from Law: how best can we respond to the claim made by certain politicians, the sun does not always shine, the wind does not always blow? I think I just answered that. So now going back to Angus King, who has another chance. Slide 11 says 10% of Asia Pacific emissions is from Australian exports. I assume most of this is from burning fossil fuels rather than post-processing of iron ore. It's what you see on the graph. It's a combination of the two, and iron ore is a very large component of that. At least iron ore processing is a very large component of that consequential emissions in the Asia Pacific. Slide 23, that's a technical question. I'll go back to that later. The graph, renewable fossil fuel rate, how does electric car and transport affect that graph? Okay, so that graph again assumes that the demand remains constant. Now, of course, if we electrify other sectors of the economy, then demand will change, it'll go up. Certainly that will affect the replacement rate, if you like, of fossil fuels with renewables. Helen Milliser, what is your view of large-scale, less than 1 megawatt biogas systems, such as large anaerobic digesters as used in other countries? These can supply quick injection and stable energy into the grid. Well, certainly there's a place for that. I would suggest at the moment that that's a fairly expensive way of doing things. And again, the learning rates will win out in the end. If we look at the economics of all these different sources, then wind and solar are already ahead of most of them. In Wibenga, is nuclear generation actually considered to be a renewable energy source? No, it's not in the strict sense. If you consider the fact that it uses fuel, it's not renewable because the fuel gets burnt and that's the end of it. But it is a zero carbon generating source. So in that sense, it contributes to decarbonisation, and so therefore it should be considered as part of the future energy mix. Whether it's too expensive, whether we want to do it or not, that's another question, but based on the fact that it is able to contribute, it should be part of the choices that we have. Let's see, have I missed anyone? Angus King again, ignoring all the environmental and economic issues of nuclear, Australia doesn't have time to look at this option to achieve a 2030 target. Let's get it off the table. Okay, so this is a very good point. It would take, let's say, 5 years to get a social license to operate nuclear, let's say, if that's what we want to do. It might take another 5 years to put a regulatory system into place. Then it might take another 5 years to build a nuclear power station. Now, you could compress that maybe a little bit by doing the social license side of things in parallel with the regulatory system. And if we say no, then we've just burned a few tens of millions of dollars of regulatory system, but that's cheap. So maybe you could do it in 10 years. So it wouldn't be contributing till the 2030s, and you're absolutely right, wouldn't contribute to the 2030 target, but it could contribute to a target down the track. How do I think this will play out? I think it's too expensive. Certainly we can regulate it so that it produces the right environmental outcomes, but I think at the moment it's way more expensive than wind and solar. What it might be less expensive than is when we're trying to do the last few percent to get us to zero carbon electricity, getting that 98 to 100% might be incredibly expensive in terms of all the extra wind and solar and transmission and storage that are needed to provide 100% of our electricity reliably. Then it might be possible for another source, I don't know if it's nuclear or tidal or whatever, but then it might be possible for another source to just come in at the last minute and plug that gap and be as cheap or cheaper than the combination of renewable storage, transmission and the rest of it. John B, would you advise how you see the role of hydrogen, storage, export, transport and others? Very good point. So hydrogen is not a source of energy. Let's make it quite clear. It's a way of storing energy. So for this reason, countries that don't have a lot of renewable energy or other sources are very keen to look at buying hydrogen, which is going to be a carbon-free form of energy generation, to meet their needs. And so it's this storage option from renewable generation in another country that is attractive to places like Japan, Korea and Germany. And so Australia has an enormous opportunity. We have very cheap renewable energy. We could create hydrogen more cheaply than other countries. and we could be a major powerhouse for hydrogen generation for those countries which are short of other forms of energy, particularly renewables. How this is going to play out, this is a really big and open question, and it's one that our grand challenge is looking at as we speak. L. Selden, nuclear fission, thorium reactors, economics. So thorium is an alternate fuel source to uranium. It's got a number of reasons that we're not really looking into it greatly at the moment. Its processing is complex. There is a fair degree of added expense around it, and not many countries are really looking that seriously at thorium reactors at the moment. But it's something to keep in the mix. Maybe something will change. Maybe we'll have a technological breakthrough that would make this interesting, and that would give us a new form that has less proliferation issues, for example. Jenny Goldie, how viable is concentrated solar thermal as at Port Augusta? So again, this is one of these niche areas, which at the moment is more expensive than solar and PV, but it might have an application for a particular need. So for example, where you have a standalone demand source, maybe it's a mine in a remote area, and you've got good solar but not very good wind. There's no pumped hydro storage because the countryside is dead flat, and you have batteries that are going to be incredibly expensive and maybe don't perform very well in the heat in that part of the world. Maybe that's an option there. Maybe it's good also to provide heat for particular processes, and I'm thinking here of processes in metal refining and in other sectors. That would be a good direct form of heat production. Again, at the moment, it looks like more or less it's expensive, but with new developments and the driving down the learning rate, maybe it will come into its own for particular niches in the future. Warren Yates, does electrolysis require pure water or is salt water enough? Australia is short of water. Well, guess what? Coal-fired power stations use a lot of water. Any thermal power station does. It's the way that we cool things down. And so, you know, again, if you look at the amount of hydrogen you get out of water, it's actually doesn't require that much water compared to, say, the water that we already use. And indeed, we could desalinate ocean water to provide the hydrogen that we need. There are also processes that are looking at using salt water without having to do desalination, but they're at an early stage. Monica Richter, I'd like to hear more about your expectation opportunities for a green steel market in Australia. What is it going to take for BlueScope, and what are the current barriers? Okay, so this is again a question that we're trying to answer in the Grand Challenge. We're looking at the techno-economic pathways to market in the Asia-Pacific region. Quite clearly, countries that have a big steel industry at the moment are not going to want Australia to come in and undercut them with cheap renewable energy located right next door to the iron ore, and thereby in a carbon-constrained world being a competitor. What they might do, though, is co-invest in this sort of facility up in the northwest of Australia, or provide the know-how and the capital for doing this. These are really open and interesting questions, and that's what we're looking at in the Grand Challenge. Andrew Geelong also asking about solar thermal, as it's got its own built-in battery. Yes, that's true, for up to 15 hours in some cases. I think I've already answered that. Ian Wabanga again. Do you think in the coming years there's a possibility that there are other viable renewable energy sources that haven't been considered yet? Potentially. Now, you know, we're looking at running up against the kind of theoretical efficiency maximum for single layer solar PV based on silicon at the moment, but there are new prospects in the pipeline For example, perovskite solar cells that might improve the efficiency, and indeed having tandem solar cells of 2 different materials absorbing at 2 different wavelengths of sunlight might also improve the efficiency of solar cells. Whether there's something else in the pipeline, that remains to be seen. But again, we've got to remember the timescales. The timescales for converting a laboratory idea into reality can be enormously long. For example, the current solar cell that is being used most in production in the world was invented in Australia by Martin Green and Andrew Blakers and others at the University of New South Wales. Andrew Blakers is now with us at the ANU in the Energy Change Institute. This was invented back in the late 80s. So it takes that long for something to become the dominant player in the world market. And so my answer is there may be something out there, but it's probably too late at this stage to do something about climate change. So we have a lot more questions still to go. Peter Campbell. There are 2 other forms that weren't mentioned. Cold fusion, no one's been able to produce it reliably, that's quite true. And plasma fusion. Again, you know, if somebody can come up with a way of doing fusion that doesn't require 100 million degrees and confinement in an incredibly complex machine like's being built in Cadarache in France for the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, then great. But there's nothing yet on the horizon that looks feasible. And so again, it won't do anything on the timeframe needed to address climate change. Let's see. GCCN, how do we get suppliers to change and legislate the way we distribute energy? That's a very good question. Again, as I said before, what is needed is to move away from this idea that there's a market out there that can magically conjure up an optimum way of allocating transmission lines to different parts of the country, and take a more realistic perspective, which is that we know where the renewable energy sources are that can generate energy the most efficiently and cheaply. What we have to do is central planning to make sure that the transmission lines get there. So I think there's a clear role for government in this. Victoria and New South Wales are already moving in this direction by adopting the Australian Energy Market Operator's idea of renewable energy zones. And we ought to just forget the market in that case and just simply move towards a central planning process and get this thing done quickly so that we don't block this rising curve of renewable energy installations that we see happening at the moment. Jan McMickle, are you aware of the plan to repower Australia? Much of what you said is congruent with it, but it's a strategic document. Thank you, I will look into that. Rosemary Race, can have the government, either party, requested these reports? We provide this type of analysis and information and research to everyone who is interested in it, and indeed we actively promote it with all sides of government. Chris Pittock, could you comment on high voltage direct current systems for getting electricity from central/northern Western Australia to the eastern states? Very good question, Chris. So when it comes to this option of Australia exporting energy to the Southeast Asian region and beyond, this is one of the things we're looking at, which is using these enormous high voltage, this is more than 1 million volts, direct current as opposed to alternating current transmission lines to be laid under the sea and to send electricity to the Asia Pacific. The same thing could be used indeed to get electricity from the northwest of Australia, where we have arguably the best solar and wind resource combination in the world, to the eastern states. And as the cost of high voltage DC comes down, we might actually see this happen. And indeed, there is a significant advantage to be able to do this, because the peak demand in the eastern states in the evening at 6 o'clock is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or whatever time it is when you don't have daylight saving. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Western Australia when the sun's still shining. And also they have excellent wind resource there as well that can complement that. So This is an interesting possibility. It's expensive, so it's probably better at the moment to have renewable energy zones within the eastern states. But as things progress, and indeed, maybe as we make more heavy industry based on electricity in the eastern states and generate more hydrogen using spilt renewable energy, occasionally we might need a top up when the sun's not shining in the east, and maybe this is a possibility for the future. Peter Gorton, are you able to comment on negawatts, improving energy efficiency and reduce demand? Yes, I've already done that. That's, again, the low-hanging fruit and the low-hanging fruit. Increasing efficiency and allowing every consumer to be able to turn off a demand source when asked to do so in order to reduce the peak demand. That's clearly something we ought to be looking at. For example, your fridge does not need to be running the compressor the entire time. The fridge probably has got good insulation, can run without a compressor for hours. So if you get asked to reduce your demand, i.e. turn your compressor off, you can do so with no penalty really to yourself, but it would be enormous saving to the grid, and you should be paid for that as part of the deal. So this is an enormous opportunity. AEMO are looking at doing this for the coming year at large scale, but in the end, it'll all be done at small scale as well. And this will be part of this Internet of Energy. The Internet of Energy, like the picture behind me, will have millions of different players all responding to demand response reductions, to generation, to using their batteries, all these things. Graham, a company in the US looked at using old rolling stock like pumped hydro. It doesn't have to be water pumped uphill. Couldn't we do this anywhere with the right terrain? Yes, you need the right terrain, or at least you need an old mine shaft with a big hole down the bottom to put the water into. Are trains more efficient than using a pump? Probably not. I would suggest that pumping water is more efficient. Aaron, how important is innovation in energy storage technology? Again, the same answer as with any learning rate, extremely important. It is what drives the learning rate. And as we've seen, the learning rate for batteries is very steep, and that's a good thing because that'll mean that the cost of batteries will come down. I would say that the learning rate for pumped hydro is very low, very flat, because it's a mature technology, but it's actually already quite cheap compared to batteries. Jenny Goldie again, a recent conversation article said Snowy 2.0 would prop up coal for 20 years. What is your view of Snowy 2.0 from the view of climate? That's a very, very good question, Jenny, very complex question. There are many things coming into play here. So it depends on, first of all, on how government plays a role in the market. Indeed, I've seen statements from Snowy saying that they will be using the renewables that they have access to drive Snowy 2.0. They're already putting out or they already have closed a tender for 888 megawatts of firm renewable energy. That is guaranteed 24/7 renewable energy based on their existing hydro. So they go out and they purchase wind and solar and they deliver this amount of energy as guaranteed supply. So it depends on how government are involved in directing Snowy Hydro to do this, but it sounds like they're moving in that direction anyway. So I would envisage Snowy Hydro to be used exactly for the reason that you would expect it to, which would be to provide storage for solar and wind, to provide guaranteed firm supply from a 100% renewable system. Richard Jansen, you say geothermal is too expensive. You seem to dismiss it. Well, the learning rate dismisses it. I don't dismiss it. It's all about economics. And so, again, you asked about fusion, and again, the same answer, it won't be viable in 2050. John Clark, what scale of green steel production would be viable starting point for a solar farm and nearby source of magnetite and green hydrogen? Very good question. We're looking at these issues of scale and aggregation as part of the Grand Challenge. And indeed, with our industry partners, there are 3 projects, or actually 4 projects already, that are looking at producing massive amounts of renewable energy up in the northern parts of Australia. One of them, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is being developed by CWP Renewables, is a partner in our Grand Challenge. And we're looking at questions like the scale required to make these types of systems viable, where you have massive solar and wind farms next to massive iron ore reserves. Indeed, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub is looking to be the 2nd largest power station in the world, second only to the Three Gorges Dam, and is projected to produce 15+ gigawatts of power. Glenn Curry asks a really important question. Would you please comment on the policy remedy to social equity problems? So I think this is a key to ensuring that we have not only buy-in from consumers in the energy transition, but it's also key to ensuring that things don't fall over while this transition is happening. So one question that needs to be asked is, does everybody have an equal opportunity to share in the cheap power that we have in the future, irrespective of their location or their background or whatever? And at the moment, the answer to that is, well, if you can't afford to put solar on your roof, then you aren't able to participate in that. So we need mechanisms to ensure that people don't have a barrier to participating in energy transformation, and in particular in things like energy efficiency and demand response. So if you don't have any money to spend on putting insulation in your roof, or you don't have money to spend on a computerized system to turn your fridge off, which means you get paid money by the electricity company for demand response, then you're not participating in the energy transformation. So we need to have ways that overcome the initial investment barriers for people on low incomes. I've proposed a scheme with Bruce Chapman at ANU. Bruce Chapman is the inventor of HECS, the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, which is what is used around the world and particularly in Australia for funding university students through their studies. And it is based on an income contingent loan, whereby when your income gets to a certain point after you've left university and you get a good job, then you start paying the loan back. But not before that. Let's say your circumstances change, you don't have a high income, you go out of the workforce, whatever reason, then you don't pay your loan back until such time as you re-enter the workforce and start your income at a particular point. The same type of mechanism could be used to fund any form of energy participation in this new marketplace. It could be used to fund rooftop PV, batteries, solar, integration with household consumables, all this sort of thing. So we're working on this type of idea, and we're looking for many other ideas to make sure that no one's left behind in the transformation we know is going to happen.
Ken, sorry to interrupt you, Ken.
Yep, Andrew.
We sort of promised that we promised you we'd get you out of here by about 8:45, 9 o'clock, and we've hit 9 o'clock.
Up there.
There's quite a few questions yet to answer, but I'm just wondering whether that finish on social equity might be a good place to draw a line under it.
I agree with you, Andrew. I think it's a very good finishing point.
Okay. Well, thank you again very much for your time and all the work you're doing, particularly in publicising all this work to the wider public. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.